Every morning, at the same small corner cafe, the same quiet ritual unfolded. An old man sat alone at the same table, hands trembling slightly, eyes fixed on the door as if waiting for something he could no longer name. And every morning, without fail, she came. She brought warmth where the world had grown cold, kindness where life had grown cruel, and dignity where time had stripped everything else away. No one noticed. No one cared. Until the day polished shoes crossed the cafe floor, legal documents replaced smiles, and the past came crashing into the present. What was once a simple act of compassion suddenly became the center of a storm involving money, power, race, and a truth buried for decades. Before the story unfolds, take a moment to like, share, comment, and subscribe to Black Voice Story, because stories like this deserve to be heard. The cafe stood on a street most people passed without seeing. It was wedged between a pharmacy and a boarded-up bookstore, its windows slightly fogged from years of steam, coffee, and conversations that never changed anything. Inside, time moved slower, especially for those who had nowhere else to be. The old man had claimed his corner table long before the neighborhood began to change. Back when the buildings were darker, the faces fewer, and hope felt less fragile. His name had once carried weight. In another life, it had been spoken with respect in factory halls and union meetings. But age has a way of erasing reputations, reducing men to silhouettes hunched over cups of lukewarm coffee. He wore the same faded jacket every day, its elbows worn thin, its pockets holding little more than loose change and folded memories. His skin carried the deep lines of a life worked hard, not always rewarded fairly, and his eyes reflected the quiet resignation of someone long forgotten by the systems he once trusted. She noticed him on her first week working at the cafe. She had taken the job out of necessity, not ambition. Rent was rising, opportunities were shrinking, and patience did not pay bills. She was young, black, and already familiar with how easily people looked past her. The cafe owner hired her because she worked harder than anyone else, because she showed up early and left late, and because customers found it easy to ignore her presence unless they needed something. At first, her interactions with the old man were routine. She brought his coffee. She cleared his plate. She offered polite nods. Nothing more. But over time, patterns emerged. He always ordered the cheapest item. He always sat alone. And he always counted his money twice before paying, as if bracing himself for the possibility of being short. She began to linger at his table just a second longer than necessary, not to talk, but to make sure he was all right. She noticed his hands shaking more each week, his posture bending lower, his movements slowing like a clock winding down. Other staff members dismissed him as just another lonely old man wasting space. Some customers rolled their eyes when he occupied a table too long. A few whispered assumptions that followed him wherever he went. She knew those whispers. She had grown up hearing them about her own family, about her community, about herself. Assumptions that stripped people of complexity and reduced them to stereotypes that felt easier to accept than inconvenient truths. One rainy morning, she noticed him struggling to cut his food. The knife slipped from his grip and clattered softly against the plate. No one else looked up. The world had taught them not to. She stepped forward, instinctively, and helped him without making a show of it. No pity, no announcements, just quiet assistance, offered as naturally as breathing. From that day on, something shifted. She began helping him every morning. Sometimes it was cutting his food. Sometimes it was refilling his coffee without charging him. Sometimes it was simply making sure he wasn't forgotten when the cafe grew busy. She never asked for anything in return. She never told anyone. And she never imagined that her small acts of kindness would one day place her at the center of a conflict far bigger than both of them. The old man never spoke much, but gratitude radiated from him in ways words never could. His eyes softened when she approached. His shoulders relaxed when she set his plate down. For a brief moment each day, the weight of loneliness lifted, replaced by the simple knowledge that someone still saw him as human. What she did not know was that the old man's story did not begin in that cafe, nor would it end there, and the world that had ignored him for so long was about to remember his name, not out of compassion, but out of greed. Weeks turned into months. The neighborhood outside the cafe transformed as developers crept in, repainting history in neutral colors and raising prices beyond the reach of those who had built the community. The cafe remained, stubborn and unchanged, a quiet witness to displacement and loss. And still, every morning the old man came. His health continued to decline. His steps grew slower. His memory faltered. And some days he stared into space as if searching for something just beyond reach. She adjusted without complaint. She walked slower beside him. She repeated herself when needed. She made sure he left with dignity intact, even when the world around him showed none. Other customers began to notice her kindness, though not always with approval. Some whispered that she was wasting time. Others suggested she was being taken advantage of. A few hinted, thinly veiled, that people like him were not worth the effort. The familiar undercurrent of prejudice ran quietly beneath their words, reminding her that compassion often came with consequences, especially when it crossed invisible lines society preferred to keep intact. She endured it all. She had learned long ago that doing the right thing rarely came with applause. One afternoon, the cafe owner pulled her aside. Business was tight. Tables needed to turn faster. He suggested carefully that maybe the old man could be encouraged to move along sooner. She listened, nodded, and continued exactly as before. Some things were not negotiable. What no one knew was that the old man's past carried unfinished business. Decades earlier, he had built something valuable with his hands and his mind, only to watch it taken from him through contracts designed to confuse and systems designed to exclude. He had trusted the wrong people, signed papers he was told were fair, and lost everything without fully understanding how. His family fractured under the weight of financial ruin and unresolved resentment. His grandson had grown up hearing only fragments of that story. He learned early that the world rewarded aggression and punished vulnerability. He studied law, not to seek justice, but to control outcomes. He chased success with relentless focus, leaving little room for empathy. To him, the old man represented failure, weakness, and an inheritance delayed. When the doctors finally insisted the old man needed assisted living, alarms sounded in places long silent. Legal documents resurfaced. Property records were reviewed. Old accounts were re-examined. And suddenly, the old man was no longer invisible. The grandson arrived without warning. He entered the cafe like a disruption, his presence sharp against the worn familiarity of the space. Expensive suit, polished shoes, a posture shaped by confidence and entitlement. Behind him followed two lawyers, faces neutral, eyes scanning for leverage. The room shifted. Conversations paused. Coffee cooled untouched. The old man looked up, confusion clouding his features, recognition flickering and fading like a faulty light. She sensed danger before she understood it. Not physical danger, but something colder, bureaucratic, calculated, the kind that crushed people quietly and legally. The grandson observed her closely. He noted her uniform, her skin, her proximity to his grandfather. Assumptions formed quickly. In his mind, she was either a nuisance or an obstacle. Papers were placed on the table. Discussions followed that excluded compassion entirely. The old man's capacity was questioned. His decisions were scrutinized. His independence was framed as a liability. And somewhere in those documents lay the implication that the young woman who had been helping him was overstepping boundaries she did not belong in. Accusations surfaced subtly at first. Suggestions that she had influenced him, that she had manipulated his vulnerability, that her kindness carried hidden motives. The weight of those implications pressed heavily, familiar and unjust. She stood firm. She had nothing to hide, but she also understood how quickly narratives could be twisted, especially when power leaned in one direction and prejudice in another. The cafe became a battleground of quiet tension. Lawyers returned. Forums multiplied. The grandson's visits grew frequent, and with each one, the old man seemed to shrink further into himself, confusion turning into fear. She continued to help him, though now every action felt watched, recorded, evaluated. The simple humanity that once defined their routine became a liability in a world that valued control over care. And then came the revelation that changed everything. Hidden within the old man's forgotten records was proof that the fortune the grandson believed lost forever had never truly vanished. It had been rerouted, locked behind clauses no one expected to survive this long. Assets tied to properties the city now desperately wanted. Value that had multiplied quietly while the old man sat unnoticed in the cafe, counting change. The grandson saw opportunity. The lawyer saw leverage. And suddenly, the old man was no longer a burden. But there was a problem. The documents required verification from someone who had consistently witnessed the old man's mental clarity, someone who could attest to his autonomy, someone outside the family, someone like her. The pressure intensified quickly. The grandson's tone hardened. The lawyers became less subtle. They framed cooperation as inevitable, resistance as foolish. They hinted at consequences without naming them. The system closed in efficient and merciless. She was summoned to meetings she never asked to attend. Her words were dissected, her actions reframed. She was made to feel small in rooms designed to intimidate. The unspoken question hung heavy in the air. Why did she care so much? The answer was simple. Because no one else did. When the old man was declared temporarily unfit, pending evaluation, she was barred from seeing him. The cafe table sat empty for the first time in months. His absence echoed louder than his presence ever had. She felt it in every quiet moment, every unfinished cup, every chair left untouched. Rumors spread. Some claimed she had crossed boundaries. Others suggested she had been chasing a payout. The ugliness of assumption flourished where truth was inconvenient. And through it all, the grandson maneuvered swiftly, positioning himself as savior rather than opportunist. Then the evaluation report arrived. It contradicted everything the grandson had claimed. The old man was found lucid, his memory fragmented but functional, his decisions informed, his autonomy intact. And crucially, his testimony about the young woman's role was clear, consistent, and unwavering. He had never been manipulated. He had been helped. The narrative cracked. Court proceedings followed. The cafe became irrelevant as the battle moved into formal spaces where power spoke loudly and empathy struggled to be heard. She testified not with anger, but with truth. She described routine, consistency, care. She described how systems fail the elderly and how kindness fills the gaps left behind. The grandson's image began to fracture under scrutiny. Emails surfaced. Financial maneuvers exposed intent. What he framed as concern unraveled into strategy. At the heart of it all stood the old man, finally seen not as a burden or a prize, but as a person whose life had value beyond what could be extracted from it. The climax came not with shouting or spectacle, but with a decision. The court upheld the old man's autonomy. Assets were protected. Guardianship was restructured to prioritize care over control. And the grandson's influence was limited, his authority curtailed by his own ambition. But the most powerful outcome came quietly. The old man requested that the young woman remain part of his daily life, formally recognized as a trusted caretaker and advocate, not because of money, not because of obligation, but because she had shown up when no one else did. In that moment, the system bent just slightly toward justice. Life did not transform overnight. Injustice rarely dissolves completely, but something shifted. The old man returned to the cafe, though not as often. His health required more care now, structured and monitored. But when he did come, he no longer sat alone. Respect replaced indifference. Recognition replaced dismissal. She continued her work, though now with a deeper understanding of how fragile goodness could be in a world driven by profit. Her role expanded beyond serving tables. She became an advocate, a reminder that dignity should never depend on visibility. The cafe owner watched it all unfold with quiet reflection. Customers changed their tone. Some apologized. Others avoided eye contact, uncomfortable with the mirror the story held up to them. The grandson retreated into his world of controlled outcomes and calculated risks, forever marked by the moment his narrative failed him. He learned that not everything could be owned, leveraged, or silenced. And the old man lived his remaining days not wealthy in the way society measures, but rich in something far more rare. He was seen. He was respected. He was not forgotten. The story spread quietly, not as gossip, but as lesson. It reminded those willing to listen that racism often hides behind professionalism, that injustice wears tailored suits, and that compassion is radical in a world that profits from neglect. Most importantly, it proved that small, consistent act of kindness can stand against systems designed to erase humanity. If this story moved you, challenged you, or reminded you of someone the world overlooks, take a moment to share, comment, and subscribe to Black Voice Story. These stories matter because they reflect real lives, real struggles, and real truths that deserve to be heard.